Welcome to KU Padashala. My name is Chad A. Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity today to discuss with you the history of Western philosophy. In this second lecture, we will examine the history of medieval philosophy, a subject which, at least within the academic system within the United States, is arguably the least taught of all branches of philosophy. This is unfortunate because a lot of really interesting things did happen over the medieval era, all of the centuries that included, but medieval philosophy today is mostly known through a series of jokes which circulate among the philosophy majors and professors on college campuses. One of these jokes is that from Aristotle to Descartes in the Renaissance, people really didn't do any new philosophical thinking. They simply quoted verbatim from Aristotle in Latin and considered that to be good enough. This is, after all, what held back the scientific revolution from starting, was the idea that the study of physics, for example, really just consisted of quoting from Aristotle's book of the same name. Another joke is that in the medieval university, technological regression from the Dark Ages had gotten so bad that there was only ever one copy of the text by Aristotle in the room, nailed to the podium so that nobody could steal it. If you have, to this day, a lecture in which people forget to bring the text to class, the professor will joke that it feels like a medieval university in which there's only one copy of the book in the room. Another joke is that medieval philosophers considered questions like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin to be among the most serious and meaningful of all philosophical inquiries, a joke which, ironically enough, was made by the medieval philosophy professor himself on campus when I was an undergrad in the United States. Far beyond these caricatures of medieval philosophy, though, you will find some of the most fascinating work ever done, which I believe is largely neglected because of how intertwined medieval philosophy was with religion. Not just the maybe Christian philosophy of, say, Thomas Aquinas, but also the Islamic philosophy of Abu Nassir AlFarabi, who was actually a major, unacknowledged influence on Thomas Aquinas himself. We will begin our discussion of medieval philosophy today, therefore, with an examination of Abu Nassir AlFarabi, a great Islamic philosopher who was born in modern-day Uzbekistan and later studied in Baghdad, and actually authored proofs of God's existence that are remarkably similar to those provided by Thomas Aquinas some 3 centuries later. In fact, you can take particular passages from Aquinas and line them up one-to-one with similar passages from Abu Nassir AlFarabi, showing maybe not plagiarism, but certainly a remarkable influence from one thinker to the other. Above all, Abu Nassir AlFarabi argued that logic was a system which could allow you to move from the things known mundanely within the world, such as the physical objects you can experience with the 5 senses, not only to the first principle, such as the very notion of substance, not just this or that substance, but the principle of substance, or even to the divine beings. You could move from the things known in this world to the highest beings like God, the angels, the soul, etc. And you could do this through purely rational means, and simply following the connections of one concept with another. Abu Nassir AlFarabi had this particular ambition of generating something of a rationalist metaphysics long before figures like Leibniz and Spinoza. That's because he understood the concept to be, by definition, that which provides representation of essences of things, in a certain sense, the ultimate definition of what that thing is without any accidental things added onto it through the idea. He argued that these ideas could themselves be worked into logical judgments, which ultimately will fit under 10 general categorical headings. The headings he largely borrowed from Aristotle himself, including substance, quantity, quality, etc. AlFarabi went a bit further than Aristotle, however, by arguing that even among the 10 categories, only 4 of them are actually simple or indivisible categories. These were substance, quantity, quality, and posture. The rest, he argued, were composites. For example, the category of having really is just the composite of 2 different judgments about substance. You have the one substance who has, and the other substance which is had by the first one. Similarly, he argued that the manifold of sense contents which are actually experienced, such as the plurality of colors which you actually see before you, are synthesized through such categorical notions into the one, but still called into question the naive belief in the real existence of the kinds of universals referred to by those concepts. His own answer to the age-old debate whether universals really exist was actually quite counterintuitive, demonstrating the rigor of his thought. He argued that universals exist in real individuals, in which case their existence occurs as something accidental, but the universals themselves must not be considered mere accidents, let alone abstractions from those individuals. They really exist, but they do so only within the individuals they are instantiated in. From this, he went on to derive an entire metaphysics dealing with the properly immaterial concerns of, on the one hand, ontology, or the purified understanding of, say, the concept of substance, the concept of accident, etc., and on the other hand, the divine science, which deals with the highest beings such as God, the soul, angels, etc. But this, of course, begged the question whether God himself is knowable. Abu Nassir AlFarabi dealt with, in a certain sense, the paradox of a perfect light. You might think naively that if a light simply became much, much brighter, you would be able to see so much better, because a little more light tends to illuminate things for your understanding. On the contrary, a perfect light would not make things easier to see. It would simply dazzle the senses, and one might argue that the same would go for God. For this reason, medieval philosophy tended to accept the distinction between things which can be known about the divine through reason alone, and other things which can never be unearthed except through divine revelation. Accepting the authority of, in the Christian case, the scriptures of the Bible, or in the Islamic case, the revelation of the Quran, as a gateway to know certain things which, no matter how intelligent you might be, no matter how rigorous your logical methods might be, you will never be able to arrive at. Even if we accept this distinction, though, AlFarabi argued that on rational grounds alone, you can derive certain characteristics of God. And you can do this by following the methodology of examining creation and then simply subtracting all of the imperfections, which obviously will not lead you to know anything about God, and then isolating the perfections seen within creation, but raising them to the highest degree possible. If you do this, you will find that God is infinitely intelligent, whereas man is only kind of intelligent. And this is precisely because materiality and intelligence were inversely related within medieval philosophy. Precisely because the mind is immaterial, it can understand better than the material body. The material body can, in a certain sense, know things from the five senses, but that is categorically inferior to the kind of contemplation of the notion which the mind is capable of. Under that logic, God's understanding is infinitely greater than ours because he's purely immaterial, and therefore bound by no limitations of materiality which we would suffer from. Another thing which you can know about God on purely rational grounds by following this method is that he is absolutely simple, precisely because he has no condition for his existence on any other being. He is also absolute truth, whereas the kinds of truths which man might be able to contemplate are simply partial truths in comparison. He's also absolute life in comparison with the partial life which humans are capable of. It is not our existence actually to exist, since each of us will die, and in fact entire species of animals have been known to go extinct precisely because their existence is not essential. But the medieval understanding of God was that it is precisely his essence to exist, which is why his life, precisely as a non-material being, is the real life. What we have is, in a certain sense, just an imitation thereof. AlFarabi went on to give 3 proofs for the existence of God on rational grounds alone, which are remarkably similar to those of Thomas Aquinas, and in very brief form are really quite similar to each other as well. The proof of motion argues that every change you see as motion in the medieval world meant more than just changing your physical location and moving in the narrow sense of the term, also just any sort of change that a thing might undergo. All of those changes had to have implied some first mover which started the process of motion, and that would really have to terminate in God himself. The second proof of the existence of God is the proof of the efficient cause, the idea that the relation between efficient cause and cause thing cannot be self-recursive. A thing cannot be its own cause, so the process of causes had to, or the chain of causes had to have terminated with God himself. The third proof for the existence of God is the proof of contingents, the idea that all change must have some origin terminating in God himself. If we move on to Thomas Aquinas, who contemplated many of the same things, but through the lens of medieval Roman Catholicism, you find that Thomas Aquinas also had to deal with the paradox that physical things have being, but have it in a much less purified or perfect form than God himself, precisely because the latter is immaterial. Thomas Aquinas' solution to this was to argue that beings participate in being in the literal sense of taking a partial part of it. In contrast, the perfect being God has a totally different way of being. More specifically, Aquinas argued that the act of being, which Aquinas scholars continue to leave untranslated from the Latin term esse, is an act of being which does not in itself imply any principle of limitation. That principle has to come from the particular essence of the given thing which participates in being. For humans, of course, that is the human nature or essence of being a human, and this allows one to participate in the act of being by providing a limitation on that principle in accord with the definition of the kind of thing which one is. God, in contrast, is perfect because finite beings have a smaller share of being as things which only exist for a short amount of time, whereas, once again, God's essence precisely is to exist. Finite beings, more specifically, have being only through the composition of esse, or the act of being, and the particular essence which defines what they are. This, however, still leads to certain logical problems, such as how there could be many individuals of the same species who are still distinct individuals who are not identical with other individuals of the same species. This is a problem in the medieval era, by the way, not only for physical or natural beings like humans or animals, but even for the immaterial beings like angels. While it is fairly easy to solve this for material beings, in that the form-matter composition distinguishes or differentiates one individual from another within the same species, in the sense that you and I are both humans, but because we are made up of different material elements, you are a different individual from me. But for angels, we don't really have that sort of possibility of referring to the composition of matter and form, because there is no matter for angels. For this reason, Aquinas was led to argue that every individual angel actually is its own species, because there is no matter to distinguish one essence from another. Thomas Aquinas also provided a solution to the equivocation of being, or the way that the word being tends to be used in several different ways, leading to metaphysical puzzles which are actually pseudo-problems that simply ignore the different way that the term is being used. This was something which Aristotle also addressed in Book 4 of the Metaphysics, but Aquinas' own answer was that being can be referred in 4 different modes, which can be ranked hierarchically from weakest to strongest. The weakest of these are beings that exist only in the order of thought. For example, you can use language to talk about negations, or the way that something is not such and such, or privations. You can speak as though it were a positive thing about the fool's lack of wisdom, for example, but the fool's lack of wisdom really does not exist except in the order of one's thinking about it. The second weakest are those processes which contain an admixture of both negation and privation. You have processes of generation, for example, of things coming into existence, of corruption, things fading out of existence, processes of motion, which once again in medieval philosophy refer to just changes in general. These are processes which are neither purely positive nor purely negative, but rather something which contains reference to both. These are, of course, weaker than those things which exist in their own right, but only in something else. You have the properties of substances, such as the colors of a given thing. You have the color black instantiated in a black cow, but the color has an inferior kind of being to the substance which it is dependent upon. And that is, of course, the most perfect class within this hierarchy, the substances which exist per se without any element of privation. William of Occam went further than Thomas Aquinas in the direction of revising traditional metaphysics by introducing what continues to be known as Occam's Razor. The informal explanation of this is that the simplest answer in a choice of many options is usually the right one. But William of Occam's own explanation of this was really more like the quote which survives to the modern era of beings are not to be multiplied beyond necessity, or the quote, plurality is not to be posited without necessity. What this really meant was that William of Occam proposed a certain trimmed down metaphysics which got rid of the categories among the 10 that had been inherited from the ancient era that seemed to not merit or justify their existence. For example, Thomas Aquinas had a separate category even for clothing, because the religious garments worn by monks, nuns, and priests really should not be subsumed under any other heading. That's not simply a quality of the person wearing it, etc. William of Occam, in contrast, proposed reducing the set of categories from 10 to just 2. There are substances, of course, and then there's qualities, kind of like the grammatical distinction between subjects on the one hand and then just general predicates on the other. He argued that the other categories only seem to be real because of language's ability to make statements about, say, quantity, relation, etc. But this linguistic ability does not in itself prove that these things really exist. For by that logic, one could creatively use language to invent any number of other new categories at will, as Thomas Aquinas arguably did. Things, in other words, might have, say, relations, but the relation itself is not some extra thing which really exists beyond the substances participating in it. Other categories, like, say, action, do indeed refer to substances which are participating in that, but the action really is not an independent thing beyond the actors. In more specific terms, he argued that the same truth value can be reached without positing the supplementary existence of such categories at all. For example, the set of true statements that include references to redness yields the same truth value as the set of equivalent statements that do not include any reference to redness itself, but only refer to red things. One might ask if one could arrive at the same truth value about red things without any reference to redness, whether the latter could simply be eliminated as irrelevant. William of Occam's general rejection of universals therefore must be understood in that highly technical and ultimately bulletproof context. One might argue, however, that even his distinction between substance and quality was still saving too much from the archaic metaphysics of Aristotle, for it's only one step further to go all the way to the postmodernist and post-structuralist idea that nothing really exists except a flux of disembodied qualities. The answer to this for William of Occam was ultimately religious in nature, in that the medieval Catholic doctrine of the transubstantiation of the Eucharist, in which case the bread really does change substance to the body of Christ, rather than just change at the higher order level of any one of its qualities. This was the real reason why William of Occam salvaged the dualism between substance and quality, was precisely in order to maintain the religious doctrine that the substance had changed, even if the appearances of bread and wine might remain at the secondary level of accidentals rather than substance. In this sense, religion was still more authoritative than philosophy in the medieval era, and we will finish this lecture with that thought. Thank you very much.